Guys, today I'm going to be showing you this recycled slingshot and how to make it. Slingshot's made from recycled milk cartons, and all of the white stuff on the slingshot is just made from 3 different recycled milk cartons, and the blue stuff could be recycled from milk carton lids or different containers. The reason that I decided to make a recycled slingshot is firstly, the materials are completely free, and secondly, with global warming and everything happened, it's becoming increasingly important to recycle material, and hopefully this will help encourage some people to do more recycling. In another video I'm going to experiment using different colours of HDPE and mixing them together. The reason that I used milk cartons is because they're made of HDPE, and HDPE is a really good strong plastic that when you heat it up becomes mouldable. So this is a really green, eco-friendly slingshot that you can just make from any lying about milk cartons or other containers made of HDPE. So the next part of this video is going to be the how-to tutorial, and it's going to be showing every step of the process of making the slingshot. So let's see how you make it. So first I printed off the Rambone files of the Rambone Slingshot, much smaller so that it fitted my hand really well, and there'll be a link in the description down below to the blueprints of the Rambone Slingshot that York Sprav has uploaded to his forum. And then I traced them onto some 18mm wood, and this doesn't have to be plywood, it can just be any wood which is 18mm thick, and then I'm going to cut it out of this wood. So I've just drilled a hole in here so that when I cut it out, I'm cutting out the shape of the slingshot, and then I'm going to be discarding the middle piece and using the outside of the shape.
So when I'm cutting out the shape, I'm going to be using a jigsaw, but you can use any saw that is able to cut out corners like this. So once I've cut out the shape, I'm just going to be cutting out a big square around it. This is going to be so that I can attach the lid onto the mould with some screws.
So now that I've cut out the shape with the jigsaw, I'm going to go over it with rasps and files and refine the shape and smoothen the edges.
So the reason that I'm smoothing the edges is so that once I melt the HDPE, hopefully it won't stick to the plywood, but unfortunately, even though I do smooth the edges, it ends up sticking to the plywood, and in the end I've just got to cut the mould apart to get the slingshot out.
So now I've filed everything so that all the edges are quite smooth and also the shape is quite symmetrical. I'm now going to cut out another board of wood, and I'm going to use screws to attach it on behind.
The screws that I'm using are long enough to attach into the second board, but they're not long enough to go all the way through and out the other side.
So now I've finished making the mould. I can easily remove the screws in the back, and then I can change the shape of the slingshot to how I'd like it for when I do another casting in the future.
So now I need to set my oven to around 175 degrees because that's the temperature at which HDPE melts, and if it's above 200 degrees it'll create fumes, but at around 175 degrees there are no fumes created.
So now while the mould is heating up in the oven, it's time to prepare the HDPE which I'm going to be melting. So the plastic which I'm melting is HDPE, and that stands for high density polyethylene, and high density polyethylene is a thermo softening plastic, so when you heat it up to a certain temperature it becomes very soft and you can mould it. The source of HDPE which I'm going to be using is going to be just normal milk cartons, and you can just cut them up into fine strips like this, and to get a big sheet of HDPE like this, not that thick, but it's absolutely solid. It only took about 2 milk cartons that were quite small milk cartons. You can also use the lids of milk cartons or most bottle tops. To identify a container or plastic as HDPE, it should have the symbol on here, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's got a little triangle with a 2 in the middle and then HDPE written below. You need to be certain that it is HDPE before you use it. Here's a better view of the symbol which I was showing you before. So to melt the milk carton, you need to cut it up into small pieces like this. You can also use different colours of different plastics, and when you mix them together it can make some quite nice patterns and colours, and I'm going to be trying that in another video, but for this video I just want some pure white HDPE. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to use some strong scissors to cut up the milk cartons into thin strips. I also need to remove the labels before I cut it up.
I've found that the quickest way to cut it up is just to cut the milk carton into one big long thin strip, just by cutting around all the edges. and then slowly going over it and cutting that long strip into small little pieces and then putting them in the container.
So this is about 1 milk carton's worth of plastic. Now I'm just going to put this into the mould and have some of it melt and compact it down, and then keep on adding more milk cartons worth until the mould's completely full.
So when I'm putting it in the mould, I just basically fill up the mould with as much HDPE as it can hold, and then I compact it all down with a piece of wood, and then I put it back in the oven and leave it for about 10 or 15 minutes so that all of the new pieces set, and then I apply more. While the HDPE is melting, I can just cut up some more. So I put it back in the oven, and then 10 or 15 minutes later I take it out. Also notice that I'm just wearing some protective gloves because 175 degrees is easily enough to burn your skin, and the HDPE is really sticky, so you've got to wear gloves, but they don't have to be pink. So here I'm just filling up a small container that I made out of tin foil with more HDPE so that I can melt it quicker, and then once it all is melted I'll just take it out and press it into the mould. So when I take out the HDPE, it's really sticky and kind of like chewing gum, but it's quite hard to get off the tin foil, so I just had to scrape it off and then pull it off with my hands and press it into the bits of the mould which had the least HDPE in it. I then put it back in the oven, and eventually, after using about 4 or 5 milk cartons, I get the mould almost completely full. Once it's full, I need to use the stick to make sure that everything's completely pressed all into the corners of the HDPE slingshot, and I need to try and press out any air bubbles now.
So I've melted all of the HDPE in here. Now I'm just going to take the slingshot mould and take this other piece of wood, which is the same size as it, press it against the mould, and then I'm going to clamp it in the vise really tightly.
I'm also using a G-clamp on the top to make sure that I'm applying even pressure to the mould and that there's no gaps in it.
I'm now going to leave the mould to cool for about an hour and a half. So this is what the mould looks like once I unclamp it, and it's all cooled down now. I'm just going to undo these 2 screws and try and get it out. So I've screwed off the back of the mould, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it looks like on the front of the mould once I've peeled off all of these excess bits here. But it's really hard to get this piece of the HDPE out, even while I was hitting it with the hammer, and it just wasn't coming out because when I clamped it really tightly, it just has attached itself to the rough surface of the wood along here. So I'm just going to make cuts with a hacksaw into the mould, and then I'll be able to take the mould off, and I might be able to reuse the mould afterwards, but I'm not sure.
So I've realised to get the slingshot out, I'm going to have to completely destroy the mould because I didn't have a good method of stopping the HDPE from being able to stick to the wood. If anyone has any better suggestions, please post a comment down below or send me a personal message. So then to get the slingshot out of the mould, I need to cut big lines down into the wood, and then I'm going to use a hammer to hammer the wood off. I then cleaned off any excess pieces with a hacksaw and flattened out any bumpy bits with a rasp.
So this is the outline of the HDPE slingshot once I've taken it out. In the end I had to just cut the mould off because the HDPE had actually got into some of the little cracks in the plywood and stuff like that, and then it had actually bonded with the plywood and it was almost impossible to get it off without smacking it with a hammer, and I ended up actually having to rasp some of the plywood off and cutting it off with a hacksaw. In the future, if I maybe coated the mould in varnish or something that's more heat resistant, then maybe the mould wouldn't stick, the HDPE wouldn't stick to the mould, and then I could reuse the mould for multiple slingshots. So now I'm going to start rasping all of the edges of the HDPE so that it's flat. From now on, since HDPE dust is really bad for your lungs, I'm going to be wearing a dust protector.
So for flattening out all of the edges, I'm just going to be using a rasp, and you can use normal woodworking tools on HDPE, but you must wear a dust mask or protector because the dust's really bad. and one of the problems with the HDPE is it can easily block up some of your rasps and files and the sandpaper, so you need to use a wire brush to clean all of the blocked up pieces off.
So I've got the shape pretty much how I'd like it. So now what I've done is I've just got some blue HDPE and I've cut out the shape of the slingshot into it, and now I'm going to laminate it on either side of this HDPE slingshot like this. And if you don't have any blue HDPE lying about, you could melt some more and you can make lots of different colours from the different lids of different bottles and stuff like that. To get the blue material, you could melt a big container like this, as long as it says that it's HDPE on the bottom here, and this has just got a 2 on the bottom so that I know it's HDPE, or you could just melt a lid like this. Also, you could practice mixing the colours together, and I might try that out in another video. So before I glue them together, I'm just going to roughen up these surfaces loads, and then I'm going to use a 2-part epoxy called epoxy resin to glue them together. So I've got the pieces of HDPE all clamped up. Now I need to leave the glue to set. That's all for part 1. Stay tuned for next week to see part 2 of the how-to tutorial, and once it's up there'll be a link in the description down below.